All right, guys, what's up? Um, this is a video just with directions and some read alouds for our assignment for March 23rd. Um, what I'll do is I'll just read through the um, through the readings that are in this assignment. I'll explain the directions and what your assignment is. Um, I'll be doing this with you when we meet. This is really for people who either missed the class or want to review what we went over at a later time. All right, so our topic today is the Great Depression. Our essential question is, what is an economic recession? How are groups and individuals affected by an economic downturn? A couple people asked this morning, are we headed for a recession? That's definitely something we can talk about. It's certainly a possibility right now. It's a little early to tell, but it definitely could happen. Our focus question: what were the major causes and effects of the Great Depression? How can we contextualize the Great Depression? It should be obvious that we're writing a contextualization paragraph. So your learning target is I can use secondary sources to write a contextualization paragraph. There's two readings in this assignment. The first one describes some causes of the Great Depression. After that, the assignment asks you to list 5 causes from that reading. It asks you to describe whether the cause is social, economic, or political. It can be more than one, so use your best judgment. After that, an article on the effects of the Great Depression, and basically the same thing as, can you identify 5 social, economic, and political causes? Effects. You're going to type that right into the document. And then the last thing, the exit ticket, is to write a contextualization paragraph. So you'll use those guiding questions and sentence starters, which you've seen plenty of times before, to write a contextualization paragraph. Remember, this is the first paragraph in both your short essay questions on the regions. All right. So the first reading, starting from page 1, it's titled The Great Depression. It starts off with an excerpt from one of the most famous songs of the Great Depression. It was very popular during the Great Depression, and after the Great Depression became something that was known as showing really the emotional toll of the Great Depression. So it says, once I built a railroad, I made it run, I made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? It's called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? You can YouTube it. There's recordings of it. I don't know if there's any recordings from that era, if they're all from later. There's probably recordings from that era. All right, so at the end of the 1920s, the United States boasted the largest economy in the world. With the destruction wrought by World War I, Europeans struggled while Americans flourished. Upon succeeding to the presidency, Herbert Hoover predicted that the United States would soon see the day when poverty was eliminated. Then, in a moment of apparent triumph, everything fell apart. The stock market crash of 1929 touched off a chain of events that plunged the United States into its longest, deepest economic crisis of its history. It is far too simplistic to view the stock market crash as the single cause of the Great Depression. A healthy economy can recover from such a contraction. Long-term underlying causes sent the nation into a downward spiral of despair. First, American firms earned record profits during the 1920s and reinvested much of these funds into expansion. By 1929, companies had expanded to the bubble point. Workers could no longer continue to fuel further expansion, so a slowdown was inevitable. While corporate profits skyrocketed, stagnant wages kept money out of the pockets of regular people. Stagnant just means like not changing. A heavy burden of consumer debt also weakened the economy. Consumers built up an unmanageable amount of consumer installment and mortgage debt, taking out loans to buy cars, appliances, and homes in the suburbs. To repay these loans, consumers cut back sharply on spending. Drops in consumer spending led inevitably to reductions in production and worker layoffs. Unemployed workers then spent less, and the cycle repeated itself. The richest 1% of Americans owned over a third of all American assets. Such wealth concentrated in the hands of a few limits economic growth. This is known as wealth inequality. The wealthy tended to save money that might have been put back into the economy if it were spread among the middle and lower classes. Middle-class Americans had already stretched their debt capacities by purchasing automobiles and household appliances on installment plans. And that was something we looked at last week when we were talking about, well, I don't know, 2 weeks ago now, when we were looking at the 1920s. There were fundamental, am I in the right? Yes, there were fundamental structural weaknesses in the American economic system. Banks operated without guarantees to their customers, creating a climate of panic when times got tough. As a result, when the Great Depression began, there were a record number of bank failures. This is when everyone panics and tries to take their money out of the bank. The bank runs out of funds and eventually has to close. When this happens, everyone who had money in the bank loses their savings. Few regulations were placed on banks, and they lent money to those who speculated recklessly in stocks. Now, bank failures can be a little bit confusing. All right, let me try to explain this as quickly as I can. Banks don't hold everyone's money at once. So say 10 people go and deposit their money in the bank, right? The bank doesn't hold on to all that people's money. The bank has to do business. So they take your money and they might loan it to someone else. All right, that's just how a bank does business. What they rely on is enough people putting money into the bank where they always have enough money so that if 2 of those 10 people want to take their money back out of the bank, well, that's fine. They have enough money to do that. But what happens during a financial panic is that everybody who put money into the bank tries to go take their money out. But like I said, the bank doesn't hold everyone's money at once. So the bank doesn't have all your money, right? It can't give everybody who put money into the bank their money back. And so the bank becomes insolvent, which basically means they don't have enough money to do the business that they need to do. Nowadays, your bank deposits are insured by the government. The idea behind that is so that during a financial panic, not everyone is running to the bank and trying to take their money out. You're not worried about it because the government insures your money in the bank. That's so that you don't have bank failures. All right. That's a very quick, simple explanation of that. There's tons of videos online on YouTube that can explain that. There's also a scene from the movie It's a Wonderful Life. If you search bank failure or bank run, It's a Wonderful Life, you can kind of get a fictional perspective on it. All right, continuing. Agricultural prices had already been low during the 1920s, leaving farmers unable to spark any sort of recovery. When the Depression spread across the Atlantic, Europeans brought fewer American products, worsening the slide. When President Hoover was inaugurated, the American economy was a house of cards. Unable to provide the proper relief from hard times, his popularity decreased as more and more Americans lost their jobs. His minimalist approach to government intervention made little impact. The economy shrank with each successive year of his presidency. As middle-class Americans stood in the same soup lines previously graced only by the nation's poorest, the entire social fabric of America was forever altered. And then in the space below, list 5 causes of the Great Depression. Please thoroughly explain what the cause was, how the cause contributed to the collapse of the economy, and whether the cause was social, economic, or political. The first one has been done for you. If you want to pause the video now and complete that part of the assignment, you should do that. All right, and the next reading, effects of the Great Depression. As the effects of the Great Depression cascaded across the U.S. economy, millions of people lost their jobs. By 1930, there were 4.3 million unemployed. By 1931, 8 million, and in 1932, the number had risen to 12 million. By early 1933, almost 13 million were out of work, and the unemployment rate stood at an astonishing 25%. Those who managed to retain their jobs often took pay cuts of a third or more. Out-of-work Americans filled long bread lines, begged for food, or sold apples on street corners. A Chicago social worker wrote that we saw want and despair walking the streets, and our friends, sensible, thrifty families reduced to poverty. Sorry. More than a third of the nation's banks failed in the 3 years following 1929. Again, that's those bank failures and the bank runs. Long lines of desperate and despairing people outside banks hoping to retrieve their savings were common. Many ordinary citizens lost their life savings when banks failed. Farmers were hit particularly hard by the crisis. On top of falling prices for crops, a devastating drought in Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas brought on a series of dust storms known as the Dust Bowl. In the South, sharecroppers, both white and black, endured crushing poverty and almost unimaginable degradation. African Americans suffered significantly higher levels of unemployment than whites due to pervasive racism. The financial crisis was not limited to the United States. Countries in Europe and around the world experienced the Depression. Hitler's rise to power in Germany was fueled in part by the economic slowdown, and throughout the 1930s, international tensions increased as the global economy declined. Economic hardship and loss visited all sections of the country during the Depression, though no group suffered more from the Depression than African Americans and Mexican Americans. A year after the stock market crash, 70% of Charleston's black population was unemployed, and 75% of Memphis's black population was unemployed. In Macon County, Alabama, home of Booker T. Washington's famous Tuskegee Institute, most black families lived in homes without wooden floors or windows or sewage disposal and subsisted on salt pork, hominy grits, cornbread, and molasses. Income averaged less than $1 a day. Conditions were also distressed in the North. In Chicago, 70% of all black families earned less than $1,000 a year, far below the poverty line. In Chicago and other large northern cities, most African Americans lived in kitchenettes. Apartment owners took 6-room apartments, which previously rented for $50 a month, and divided them into 6 smaller unit kitchenettes for $32 a month each. Buildings that previously held 60 families now contain 300. The Depression hit Mexican American families especially hard. Mexican Americans faced serious opposition from organized labor, which resented competition from Mexican workers as unemployment rose. Bowing to union pressure, federal, state, and local authorities repatriated more than 400,000 people of Mexican descent to prevent them from applying for relief. Since this group included many United States citizens, the deportations constituted a gross violation of civil liberties. All right. In the space below, list 5 effects of the Great Depression. In your response, please thoroughly explain what the effect was and whether the effect was social, economic, or political. The first one has been done for you. All right, so the last part, the exit ticket. You guys have all seen this before, so I'm not going to read through this. There's some guiding questions. There are some sentence starters. I will basically be doing all this when we meet 8th period today, but if you want to go back and watch this again, it'll help you complete the assignment. All right.